Let's see. So anyway, welcome to all of you. And this is a kind of a co-event. It's a Tech Soup event. It's also a QuickBooks Made Easy for Nonprofits event, and it's a Good Steward Church Academy event. And we've all conspired to help teach you about clergy payroll. Uh, I'm not sure there's anything I need to say. There may be. There's a little disclaimer here. And what else do we have? I am Greg Bosson. I am a CPA. I specialize in nonprofit organizations, and churches and houses of worship are kind of a subsection of that. I have a company called QuickBooks Made Easy for Nonprofits, and all we do is teach nonprofits how to use QuickBooks. Now, Barbara Starley, who that's Barbara, that's such an incredible picture of you, by the way. I mean,
Thank-
although, do you ever really put your hand on your chin like that, or was that specifically for the? Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen you do that outside of this photograph. But anyway, the point is, all Barbara does is specializes in houses of worship. Okay. And so she'll tell you a little bit more about herself in a second. But the two of us have teamed up to really get the word out and help train houses of worship on how to use QuickBooks and also just other accounting stuff that affects houses of worship, and that would obviously be pastor and payroll would be included in that. I'm going to just show you my website real quick because she being Barbara, is going to give you some discount coupons for a training that we are doing for houses of worship. It's coming up. And to get to it, you go to quickbooksmadeeasy.com, you click on courses and training, and you go to live webinars. And it is a training that we do once or twice a year. It's just for houses of worship. Here it is right here. It's happening July the 29th, 30th, and 31st. 2.5 hours a day. It's QuickBooks for Houses of Worship, 3-day webinar series for users of QuickBooks Online. You're going to get a discount when you sign up for this if you use the coupon that Barbara is going to show you. Barbara's the one who's going to be teaching it. So let's let's look at Barbara teach and see how incredible she is. Uh, and then at the end of this time, you can get the coupon and sign up for that. I think that's all I have. Do we get continuing professional education for that, Bill? Can we do that? I think we can. Bill? Yes, you can. I want Barbara to make sure that you do. There's probably a poll related to CPE that you could put out at the very end. I'm going to go ahead and stop my share now, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Barbara, and let you share.
And then I will share. And then, but in the meantime, Aretha, did you have some like housekeeping things that you wanted to talk about first?
Think we've kind of covered it. I don't want to waste any more of your time. You need all this time.
Yeah, we only have there's 57 people in there now. We are cool with you asking questions in the chat. Barbara will be taking those questions. You can also put them in the Q&A if you want, but I think Barbara's probably just going to look at the chat. I don't think there's going to be too many. I don't think it's overwhelming with this number of people. The session is an hour. Is that right, Barbara?
The session is 1 hour. Yep.
Yep. All right. All right. It's all you, man. Go for it.
All right. Very good. Has everyone seen my screen? The cover
Yeah,
screen.
answer her in the chat.
Yes. Okay. Good deal. All right. Perfect. All right. I just want to make sure that we're moving on here. All right. Just quickly, this presentation is protected by copyright law. It's for educational purposes only. Obviously, I don't know your exact situation, so you should, if you do need that kind of help, just keep it in mind that this is an educational opportunity. We already saw the introductions, and I am affectionately known as the church lady. I love working with churches. I believe it's my calling. And there's a little story in my on my Good Steward Church Academy website that kind of tells the story of how I really believe that I've been called to this purpose, and I'm really excited to be able to speak today. And I really appreciate that TechSoup sponsors this because I think it's such a big deal. There are so many questions concern about clergy payroll that we're going to answer today. Hopefully, it'll be nice and clear, and you'll get your questions answered. If you do have questions, you can put them in the chat. Here we go. So our agenda for today is that we are going to talk about who can be considered clergy. That's where we're going to start. Not everybody can be considered clergy. So we're going to talk about what are the specific things. What does dual status mean? That's something that you hear a lot related to clergy. We're going to talk about clergy compensation, including housing allowances. We're going to also talk about reporting clergy compensation for tax purposes, and then some common misconceptions about clergy taxes. So before we get started, and because especially if you need CPE credit, we need to do a couple polls to make sure we know that you're here. So the first poll, if you want to go ahead and launch that, is what is your role at your house of worship? And we want you to answer on the poll rather than in the chat.
If you say other, go ahead and put in the chat what other means.
Yeah, good idea.
Director of Operations.
Director
I
of
like that,
Operations. Okay.
Michelle.
That sounds like a leadership.
Kathy is a clergy spouse.
Okay, good.
Poor Kathy, who is stuck with doing all the bookkeeping.
Tax return preparer. Oh, good. Yeah, there's yeah, I work with a lot of tax return preparers. It's good. Nice. All right, cool. All right, we have almost everybody is participating. We've got 10 of you that haven't answered, but we'll go
That's
ahead.
okay.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and stop the poll there. Thank you for answering. That does help me just get a feel for who I'm talking to and the audience. So, all right. All right, so we'll go ahead and move on then. We'll start again with the agenda. We're going to be talking about who can be considered clergy. So this information comes straight out of the irs.gov website. And there's three main things. The person needs to be licensed, ordained, or commissioned by a church or denomination. I was working with one denomination, and they called them fellowshipped. But licensed, ordained, or commissioned are the words that the IRS uses. Can you close the poll so we can see? You should be able to close the poll.
Yep.
Okay. All right. They need to be a common law employee of a religious body, again, a church or a denomination. And that's like a little preview of coming attractions on some of my questions that are going to come up. And the worker needs to perform certain ministerial duties. And those duties are broken down like this. They need to administer sacerdotal functions. That means they need to be administering the sacraments. So depending on your church, that might be baptism, that might be weddings, it might be communion or mass. Those types of sacraments in your church is part of that function. They need to conduct religious worship. These are either or. They don't have to be and, but they are in a management responsibility in the control, conduct, or maintenance of a church or denomination. So like a director of operations can be a pastor of administration, for example. They are generally considered a religious leader, or they need to be considered a religious leader by the church or denomination. So those are kind of the requirements of who can be considered clergy. I want to make a key point here is that just calling somebody a pastor of X does not qualify the person as clergy for tax purposes. Okay, so they're very the IRS is very clear on who can be that. But I had one client that they called everybody. Well, they're the pastor of hospitality, and they're the pastor, but they weren't doing any of the functions, nor were they really considered a religious leader in the organization. So just calling somebody a pastor of something does not qualify them for the clergy for tax purposes. So you might be saying, well, why does it matter? Why is being a clergy and having that status important? Well, several things. One is the classification determines how the clergy will prepare his or her tax return for income tax and Social Security and Medicare purposes. There is potentially a double benefit of being able to deduct mortgage interest and real estate taxes as itemized deductions and exclude those same expenses from federal and potentially state income taxes. What about a llama in bond predates Buddhism? I don't know the answer to that question, Joe. I apologize. I'm not familiar with that. I would have
I
to,
mean, I assume if they're doing any sort of like, you know, talking or whatever, I would assume any sort of aiding, I would think that would work.
yeah, I think yeah, I would go through those and do they do these things? And then those are the qualifications. Housing allowance is, and notice the asterisk, excluded from federal and most state income taxes. Just by the way, I know the one that I know of for sure is in Pennsylvania. Housing allowance is not excluded from state income tax. There might be others also, but that one's the one that always pops up. But there is an asterisk there. We'll come back to that. They're exempt from mandatory income tax withholding. Okay. But they can voluntarily withhold income taxes to cover federal income tax and SECA. And they're exempt from SE taxes under very limited circumstances. So these last four little boxes that you see starred, we're going to talk about them in more depth. So hold your questions regarding that. Okay. These are kind of the importance of being clergy. All right. So what does dual status mean? Well, dual status in the easiest form is that the clergy has the status of an employee for income taxes and benefits, right? They're going to be qualified for the retirement plan. They should be qualified for your health insurance product. They should be covered by your workers' comp. So they're the status of employee for income taxes and benefits, but they also are considered self-employed for Social Security and Medicare. So that's probably about as clear as mud, right? Because you're like, well, are they an employee or are they self-employed? So now you're looking at, well, in that case, which form should I be using for clergy? And that's going to be our next poll. We're going to post a poll and see what you know so far. So which tax form do you think the clergy should receive from the house of worship? And go ahead and put that in the poll. You can launch that and just go ahead and answer what you think. Geraldine, yes, we will give you a printout of the notes. All right, excellent. Yeah, so most of you are saying a W-2. We're going to go ahead and end the poll. And a few of you, a good number of you are saying both. So we're going to go ahead and stop that. And I'm going to give you the answer here in a second. All right, so which form should be used for clergy? We always need to give the person a W-2. Okay, we would never give a clergy that's an employee of your church a Form 1099. The only exception on the 1099 would be if you have a guest pastor and you're paying them like an honorarium. Okay, but that's not considered an employee of the church. So in that case, if they come in for a Sunday or a Saturday night service or something, you would do a 1099 for them. But then they're not qualified for housing allowance. They're not qualified for any of the other things. So we're talking about an employee of the church that's considered clergy. You must use a W-2 and a W-2 only. Okay, the IRS does not ever want to see a W-2 and a 1099 from the same organization. Okay, so So that's really important. Okay, the next thing that we're going to talk about is clergy compensation. And we're going to get into the housing allowance because that's always a little bit of a bugaboo for people. So first of all, I like to say that we want to look at clergy compensation as a pie. Okay, this is such a great visual because so often I see even on your chart of accounts, personal recommendation is you're going to have clergy compensation. You don't need to split out salary versus housing. That's all going to happen behind the scenes in your payroll records so that everything gets on the W-2 correctly. But when we're talking about clergy compensation, we're talking about what are they getting paid for and taxed on, and you want to look at it as a pie. So the salary portion, this is pretty easy, is going to be included in income for income tax and SE tax or SECA, remember. And then the housing is excluded from federal and most states' income tax, but it is subject to SE tax. And then the benefits, we're going to talk about this also, may be taxable for both income tax and SECA taxes. So really important, and thank you for answering that. Yeah, pastors are not considered contractors, and your musicians, I would be very careful with that. Let me just pause there because that is really a good question. We need to remember that when we're talking about classification of workers in the church, it all depends on one word, and that's control. How much control do you have over how much they make? How much control does the church have over when they show up to do their job? And how much control does the church have in terms of providing the tools to do the job? My guess is that the pastor is not bringing his own microphone. My guess is that your musicians are not bringing their own audiovisual aids, right, to show the words of the songs that are being sung. So we need to be really careful about that, okay? It all comes down to control. And therefore, they need to be, and that goes back to the point, is that clergy need to be on a W-2, and probably your musicians do as well, but that's outside the scope of this training. Okay, so when we look at the clergy compensation pie, and we know that it's kind of broken down into these bits and these types of pieces, I want to make a key point here. Changes to a housing allowance changes the size of the piece, not the size of the pie. So going back to this, I'm going to just visually, I think this is so important. I had a client do this too, where the person doing the payroll, the pastor had come in and he had gotten approval for his housing allowance, moved, did another housing allowance worksheet and got approved for a higher housing allowance. And they increased the housing allowance, but they forgot to decrease the piece of the salary. And this went on over a course of several years, actually, where the housing allowance kept going up, but they never modified the salary portion in their payroll. And pretty soon that pastor was being paid about $30,000 more than what they thought the compensation pie was, because they were keeping track of them in pieces. And every time he increased the housing, it was increasing the size of the pie rather than increasing the piece of the pie. So really important to note that is that when somebody, if you know, let's just take an example. Let's say you're going to pay a pastor $80,000. That's going to be his compensation. And of that, $30,000 is earmarked and approved for his housing. And his salary portion, let's say, is 50. Okay, so if the pastor moves, gets a bigger house, has a more housing allowance, he may say, hey, I need to increase my housing allowance because I have more expenses. I'm going to bump that up to 40, and I'm going to have 40 in housing, and then he should have 40 in salary. The pie doesn't change. It's the piece of the pie that makes the difference. And that's a really important note, because you don't want to all of a sudden have somebody making more than you thought they were supposed to make. Let's see.
Barbara, I'll read it to you. Hattie says churches don't file taxes, so she thinks that how could she possibly do any sort of a W-2?
Oh,
Um,
this is an excellent question, Hattie. Thank you very much for asking that. Churches are exempt. The church itself is exempt from taxes. Yes, you are 100% right. But they are totally subject to payroll taxes. Payroll is a completely different universe of taxes, and they 100% should be filing payroll tax returns for their employees, just like every other business. Just like every other, they actually have fall under Department of Labor rules, Fair Labor Standards Act, all of that. Just, but filing taxes, like they don't, you're right, from a Form 990, churches don't even have to file a Form 990, but they still have to do all the payroll stuff. Hopefully that answered that question.
well, she also says if you're this is again from Hattie, the pastor says they don't need housing or benefits. So how do you handle this? I mean, I don't know what you would say to that. Just give them
Yeah,
salary, I guess.
we're gonna talk about this. That's a really good question also. So we're gonna hit all of that coming up on how are we going to deal with the housing portion. And remember, one of the caveats of being clergy that I mentioned earlier was that they are not required to have mandatory withholding. So we will talk about that and why they may want to change that, why they may want to opt to voluntarily have taxes withheld. Okay. All right. So let's move on with the perfect timing because we are going to talk about clergy compensation. We're thinking of it as a pie, and we're going to talk about the piece of the pie that has to do with housing. So when a clergy is hired, there is a major benefit to them personally from a tax standpoint to have a portion of the pie earmarked as housing. Okay. However, it's incumbent upon the board of the church to understand that they are responsible for approving the housing allowance based on the lesser of three. And we're going to talk about what those three things are. So let's go through the three areas that we're going to compare and decide which is the lesser of our actual expenses, which would include the mortgage, principal, and interest. It would include or rent. If the person is renting, it could be rent, real estate taxes. Sorry. So the mortgage, principal, and interest, real estate taxes, home and renter insurance, HOA fees, utilities, potential repairs, yard maintenance, but not a cleaning person that comes into the house. They can actually, in the year of purchase, estimate that they're going to, they may estimate that they're going to buy furniture and appliances. And technically, they can actually say, I'm going to make a down payment in the year of purchase, and that could be part of their actual expenses. However, I'm just going to put a really big however on that. Because it's going to be the lesser of three, they rarely are going to also be able, they're rarely going to be able to include furniture, appliances, and a down payment in the year of purchase, okay, because of the lesser of three rules. So let's go. The second area is the fair rental value. So now the clergy has said, this is what I think is going to be my estimated actual expenses. And now we have to compare that number to what a furnished rental would go for in the area, comparable size, comparable area, plus utilities. So that's the first comparison. And then finally, there could be a third parameter here, Whereas as the house of worship, you've made the decision that you want your pastor to be a good steward of their money, and that the board may have decided we don't want to have more than, let's say, 40% of their income to be designated as housing. So your board may have decided no more than 40%, or we're not going to give them more than X. But it's always based on the lesser of three. So let's look at what you can do. What you want to do is you want to go through this process of having a housing allowance worksheet, okay? And this allows the pastor or the clergy to fill out this top section, and then the board to figure out, well, how does that compare to the fair rental value? And how does it compare to the board or congregation designation? Okay. So I will tell you this third one is pretty rare. I don't see very many houses of worship that say we're gonna limit it to a percentage, but some do. So that's why I want to make the point. And then you would compare. You'd go, well, the pastor said one amount, but the fair rental value says that would be not that maybe it's would be less than that, right? Or maybe the fair rental value would be more than that. So whichever one is the lesser of is the one that's going to get approved. And literally, you can fill this form out, circle the one, and then sign it that says this is what we've approved. So now you have it in writing. So I do have a housing allowance worksheet available on my Good Story Church Academy website. And if you use the coupon code Pastor25, you'll get $25 off of that resource. Okay, so here are some really big suggestions. My understanding is that no matter what the housing allowance is, the pastor has to show on his taxes all related expenses, otherwise they can't claim it all and then pay taxes. You know, justify it. Okay, we will talk about that, Karen. Great question, but we will definitely get to that. Okay, so here are some suggestions about the housing allowance approval process. First of all, you should have a document. It should be approved and it should be in writing. Okay, so we want to make sure that we dot our I's and cross our T's. It's a good idea. You can see that on this form, we say for the tax year, and with a line, assuming that you would put actually a year in there. It's a good idea, though, to include what I call a safe harbor clause so that you can continue that same allowance beyond the year. Because if you don't, if you say this is for the tax year 2025, then if you don't get a new housing allowance in time for the first payroll in 2026, there's no approved housing allowance. So having a safe harbor on your housing allowance worksheet is a really good idea. The next thing is, don't become your clergy's tax advisor. This is not the role of the church. It can get you into trouble. The person doing payroll can give poor tax advice, and you don't want the clergy coming back and saying, well, you didn't tell me this, or you should have told me this. They should be able to go to their tax advisor and get the information that they need to help them with this process, okay? You should always encourage your clergy to seek guidance from a qualified tax person, okay? You, as the house of worship, should seek guidance from a qualified realtor regarding the fair rental value. I'm going to guess that you have a realtor in your congregation that you could say, hey, our clergy lives in this area. He's got a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home. And if it was furnished, what would that go for? And what do you think the utilities would be? And I'm going to guess that realtor can give you that number pretty quickly, right? So now you at least have a way to make that determination of what that fair rental value is plus utilities. And that's a really good idea. It just says that we took that step to do that. And then again, sign and date the form and record it in your board minutes, okay? How is a church provided parsonage tax to clergy? This is a great question, Melba. A church provided parsonage, so what we're talking about here with the housing allowance is what we call housing, it's called a housing allowance in cash, right? So we're going to give you, or we're going to take that pie, and part of your payroll is going to be paid to you in the form of a housing allowance. When it comes to a church provided parsonage, it is also taxed to the clergy, and it is added to the W-2, but it doesn't get added to their paycheck. It just gets added to their W-2 as additional taxable non-cash housing allowance. And it still shows up in the same place on the W-2, which I'm going to show you in a minute. But it is, and it's determined normally on the fair rental value. That's the easiest way to talk about it. What if a pastor decides to purchase $1 million home, but membership average is less than a quarter of that? Are there limitations like this? So again, the house of worship can always say, we aren't going to allow you to purchase $1 million home because, you know, they might just, that can be that board or congregation designation. We don't think that's being wise. And hopefully your clergy is willing to listen to the wise counsel, right? If they, but membership average is less than a quarter of that. They're really, technically, a clergy can have 100% of their compensation earmarked for housing. And this happens primarily if you have two people in the home, spouses that are both working, and they're like, all of the compensation really just goes to pay for all of our housing. So they technically can, but that's where the board might say, we aren't going to let you do that. So, but you can't go in and say, if you remember, you're in charge of the pie, right? The house of worship is in charge of the pie. So if you say, we're going to only pay you $60,000, they're not going to turn around and give you a housing allowance for $1 million home. Your pie is only $60,000, right? So when you're talking about your membership and how much your membership and your donations are, that's all part of your budget, is to decide how much you're going to pay the pastor or the clergy total, and then you figure out the piece of the pie. Hopefully that answered the question. We do it that way because housing has to be proactive, never retroactive. You guys are like right on it. That is exactly my next slide. You're going to love this. Okay, so housing allowances must be formally designated and approved in advance. Okay, you cannot establish, apply, or change a housing allowance retroactively. I just had this question come up with a client that said, our pastor needed to replace his roof. And he wants, and has already replaced his roof. He had to pay for it. It was like a quick thing, right? Had already paid for it. It had already happened. But he wanted to change his housing allowance to say, well, that we want another $5,000 to be housing, and you can take it out of our salary. And I'm like, you can't. It's already done. It can't be applied to a prior, even if you haven't paid for it, it can't be applied to a prior expense. It always has to be proactive, okay? Never retroactive. So that's a really important thing to know when people are like, oh, I just had this happen in my home and I want to change my housing allowance. Well, it already happened. You can't change it for those things. And that's an important thing too, because if you have that safe harbor clause, and this was a once in a 20-year thing that they're going to have to replace their roof, you want to make sure that they know if they change that, they're actually dealing with possibly a higher housing allowance than they need next year, right? So keep that in mind as well. Okay, so there is an exception, and someone else made this comment, so I love this. Let me just check, Susan. Can housing allowance be designated during the year and take effect for the rest of the fiscal year? Yes. The clergy can go back and say, hey, I'm moving in July, or I underestimated my expenses. We're going to talk about that actually right now. And but they can change it as long as the board approves that. Some boards are like, we're not going to do this. you're going to do it at the beginning of the year, and we're not going to talk about it again until December, right? But I would say um, most houses of worship are pretty lenient. We don't want you changing it back and forth and back and forth. But if you moved and things changed, and you need to change that piece of the pie, then as long as it gets approved in writing in advance, then you can make changes. So that's a good question, Susan. Okay, there are exceptions to the housing allowance. So remember the little asterisk I said, housing allowance is, with an asterisk, excluded from federal and most state income taxes, okay? So I'm going to just read this because this comes straight off the IRS.gov website, but they put it in a big long paragraph, and I think to break it down, it helps. It says, if your housing allowance, or the clergy's housing allowance, exceeds the lesser of 1, reasonable compensation, 2, the fair rental value of the home, or 3, your actual expenses directly related to providing the home, then you must include the amount of excess as additional taxable income on your tax return. So going back to the idea of the housing allowance, at the beginning of the year, let's say in December and before the first payroll in January, the pastor has gone through the housing allowance worksheet, estimated what he thought would be actual expenses. The board has compared that to fair rental value, and they don't have any other special designations or restrictions on that number. And the lesser of the two, of those two then would be, let's say, the actual expenses. But then, or the estimated actual expenses. So the housing allowance is set, right? And so the piece of the pie gets paid out. And now we get towards the end of the year, and let's say the clergy overestimated, but they still got the payroll segmented. Here is a very important point. It is the clergy's responsibility to calculate and report any excess housing allowance on his personal tax return. Okay, it is the clergy's responsibility, not the payroll responsibility to go in and say, hey, how are you doing compared to what you thought? Nope, not the house of worship's responsibility. It is the clergy's responsibility to calculate and report any excess housing allowance. I think this flow chart will help us also kind of look at how this all goes about. So all the blue squares here are going to be clergy related, and all of the kind of purpley squares are going to be your house of worship. So who's responsible? So hopefully this will help you. So first of all, the clergy needs to calculate his or her expected housing expenses. The clergy then requests a housing allowance from the house of worship. Okay, so whatever your policy is, who gets to approve that? Usually it's the board gets to approve that. The house of worship designates the housing allowance based on the lesser of 3, which we just talked about. The house of worship adjusts the pieces of the compensation pie and pays the clergy accordingly. The clergy then needs to track their housing expenses throughout the year, actual housing expenses, compared to what they're getting in their housing allowance. The house of worship is going to inform the clergy of the amount that they've given to the clergy as a housing allowance at the end of the year. And then the clergy needs to file their personal tax return, including the housing allowance on Schedule SE and any excess housing on page 1 as taxable income of their personal tax return. So again, if you're in the payroll department, you're not the one that's going to go back and try to adjust the W-2. The W-2 is what it is, and it's up to the clergy to report that correctly on their tax return. Okay, here's a pro tip for you. You might suggest this to your clergy. Hey, we could deposit your housing allowance into a completely separate checking account for you, and then you could pay all of your housing qualified expenses from there, and you'll know at any point in time how you're doing compared to the housing allowance. So let's think about that. This is a really good idea. The housing allowance goes into a separate account. The clergy pays their expenses, and they go, wow, I'm running short every month. I don't have enough to pay that. Maybe they should ask for an increase in their housing allowance. Or the other way, wow, I always have about $300-400 left over at the end of the month. This is accumulating in this housing allowance account. I'm going to need to be setting aside tax money to pay for the excess housing allowance that I received. So that's a really good idea. Okay, is there any real disadvantage to over designating housing allowance? We just pay normal taxes on the excess amount. There's not really any disadvantage because your housing allowance is 100% taxable for SECA tax purposes. And it's only the extra that is going to, the excess housing allowance that is going to be taxable for federal and potentially state taxes. So it's not, there's not really a disadvantage per se, except that you have to remember to put that excess on as taxable income. You got to track that. If you over designate out, but it costs you dollars if you under designate. Yes. If you under designate, which is why you want to keep track of this, if you under designate, you kind of lose the benefit of that housing allowance being federal income tax free. So you don't want to underestimate, but you don't want to be so far over that it doesn't make sense either, right? Okay, I think I got that. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to how do we report the clergy compensation. So we've already had the conversation that we know that it's going to be, the clergy compensation is going to be on a W-2. So let's just look at the W-2 and what it would look like for you. First of all, in box 1, this is going to be where the salary plus any taxable benefits will show up. Box 16 is generally the same number as box 1, unless the housing allowance is taxable for state income tax. Okay, so that's important to know. But generally, those are the same, except in Pennsylvania, as far as I know. Box 14, this is where your housing allowance should go. Box 14 is an informational box. This is to help your clergy know how much of their pie was for housing allowance so that they can compare that to their actual. Okay, so that's informational only, but it needs to be on there. Boxes 3, 4, 5, and 6 should be blank or 0 for clergy because we don't have Social Security wages, we don't have Medicare wages, we don't withhold Social Security tax, we don't withhold Medicare tax, and by the way, we don't match Social Security and Medicare taxes, right? Because we don't withhold anything. So those 4 boxes should be left blank on, or they should say 0 on a clergy's payroll. You'll also notice that clergy are exempt from mandatory income tax withholding. Okay, so they don't have to have income tax withheld. But a little star on this because they can actually request to have taxes withheld. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. So just hold that spot for one moment. Let me just check and see if there's anything. Voluntary federal withholding. We are going to talk about that. Excellent. Can you deduct other expenses such as mileage, cell phone, and supplies from the housing allowance that goes on Schedule SE? No. Mileage isn't a housing allowance. Cell phone isn't a housing expense. And like office supplies or reference materials, no, they're not housing related. They have to be qualified housing expenses. And that was the list when I had the 3 little pillars of the lesser of 3. Those are the only things that can be deducted. Just like you can't deduct your cleaning lady as a housing allowance, even though it takes care of the house, right? Okay, so what's included in box 1? This is really important because we kind of look at this and we go, okay, well, we of course know salary and bonuses are going to be in box 1, but what else might be hiding behind the scenes that really should be in box 1? Clergy appreciation and love offerings. If they're coming through and you're paying it, if they're coming through from your congregation, they're passing through the church and they're going to be added and they're going to be given to the pastor, they need to be on the W-2, box 1. Cash and cash equivalents. You want to give your pastor a $1,000 gift card? Taxable. Non-accountable allowances. Let's say you're going to give your pastor a $300 allowance for auto. They don't need to account for the mileage. They don't need to use it for church purposes. 100% taxable in box one. Non-accountable discretionary funds. This is probably the one that gets people the most. If you have a discretionary fund for your clergy and they can spend it any way they want and they do not need to account for how it is spent or prove that it was spent for a legitimate church purpose, it is 100% taxable in box one as taxable income. Moving expenses. You decide that you're going to be moving somebody from Pennsylvania to Hawaii and you're going to pay their moving expenses. That is also taxable. Sabbatical expenses. You can't pay to send your pastor to Italy with his family because you feel like, wow, he's worked really hard and he deserves a vacation. So does the bookkeeper, right? That you can't pay for his sabbatical expenses if there's any kind of personal benefit to that. Payment of personal insurance premiums. This comes up a lot as your clergy ages and they're like, hey, Medicare, I can qualify for Medicare and that's going to be less expensive for the church to do that, to have me on Medicare. How about you just reimburse me? They are now paying for your personal insurance premium and it is taxable to you. Payments in lieu of employers' FICA or SICA. So many churches are like, well, we kind of feel bad because SICA is really the Social Security and Medicare that would have been withheld, and then we would have matched it as a church if they weren't clergy. So we're going to give the pastor what we would have paid in FICA taxes and just help him with his SICA. That needs to be added to box one. Okay. Mileage, cell phone, and supplies are expenses and are a line item designated amount not included in a pastor package. Correct, Trish, that's a really good point. If you're paying for a mileage reimbursement as an accountable plan, if you're paying for, you have to be careful about paying for a personal cell phone, or you're paying for church-related reference materials that they're using in the church. Yeah, those should be budgeted line items. They shouldn't be part of your pastor compensation at all, right? They're completely separate. But again, they all have to have a receipt. All right, so here's a good poll question for y'all. Did any of these inclusions surprise you? Your answer are, nope, we're all dialed in, not sure. Pretty sure we're not including some of these. Or eek, we got a lot of explaining to do. Oh, good. I'm so glad. A lot of really good houses of worship here. It looks like a lot of you really understand what is supposed to be included in box one. That's great. Awesome. Reimbursement of medical can be part of a package that is exempt from tax if set as flexible spending account. Yes, there are. That's a whole nother training on QSERAs and the different benefit packages that can be available. But if you're just saying, I'm just going to reimburse you and you don't have a defined plan like that, that is equitably applied to all of your employees, then it's going to be taxable. Yeah, excellent. Good. All right. Well, 70% of you have it all dialed in, and I'm really, really happy to see that. So good deal. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the share on that. All right. Let's see if I have anything else right here. All right. Let's go ahead and move on. We're almost out of time. So I want to be very conscious of that. Okay. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is 3 common misconceptions about clergy taxes, okay? And the 3 that come up most and I have literally worked with hundreds of churches now, and I'm so grateful for that opportunity. But these three things about clergy taxes come up over and over, and that's why I want to make a point about them. The first is that churches can pay or reimburse the clergy's FICA or SICA taxes with no tax consequence to the clergy. We kind of already touched on that, but I want to make that point again. Clergy cannot have any taxes withheld That's a misconception. And the clergy must file a Form 4361, otherwise Social Security and Medicare taxes will be withheld. So we're going to talk about all three of these one by one. Okay, so we're going to take the first one. Churches can pay or reimburse the clergy's FICA or SECA taxes with no tax consequences to the clergy. That is wrong. The clergy must pay SECA taxes personally. Any payments in lieu of the FICA, of the employer's FICA, or a SECA allowance or a SECA stipend, you can call it any of that. If it's a payment in giving it back to the clergy because you feel bad that you're not paying your quote unquote fair share of his FICA, that's additional compensation to the clergy. And payments in lieu are included in box 1 of the W-2 as taxable income. Okay, so we kind of went through that, but I do want to show you where that is going to show up. So clergy pay their SECA taxes or SE taxes personally. And when we're talking about SE, the reason it's called SE is that the clergy is going to file an extra form as part of their personal tax return called a Schedule SE. And they're going to put all of their church compensation, all of the money that they've gotten that is taxable, including their housing allowance, on this form as church employee income. And then they're going to make all their calculations, and they're going to end up adding the SE tax, whatever kind of falls out here, will end up landing on the second page of their personal tax return. Okay. Okay. Second one, please. And then, okay, so clergy cannot have any taxes withheld. We kind of alluded to this already. That is not true. If there is no withholding, then the clergy generally makes quarterly estimated tax payments on their own. But a clergy can request to have extra withholding to cover his or her federal income tax and SECA taxes. They can ask you to do that so that they don't have to remember to do their quarterly estimated taxes. And I'll tell you, and we'll talk about why that might be a good idea. And then the third thing is taxes that are withheld would show up on the W-2 in box 2 as federal income tax withheld. It's still, even if they're saying, well, I want to use this to cover my SECA taxes, still nothing is going to show up in box 4, box 3, 4, 5, and 6. So, all right. So estimated taxes are due quarterly. So if there's no withholding, the IRS doesn't want the clergy to wait till the end of the year to get their money, right? So they go, no, you're going to have to pay this quarterly. But the quarters are really weird, right? And this is where clergy can get in trouble because they could have a penalty if they don't hit these deadlines. The first deadline is April 15th. Kind of makes sense because the end of the quarter was March 31st. 15 days later, they've just done their tax return. They know, so that, okay, April 15th. But guess what? Your next quarterly payment is due 2 months later, June 15th. It's not even the end of the quarter. But your estimated tax payment is due June 15th. So now you're like, well, how am I going to do that? You know, because I just paid in April. But they want the same amount on June 15th. Then the next one is 3 months later, September 15th. Again, not the end of the quarter. That would have been September 30th. And these are the 2 quarters that a lot of people miss that are doing quarterly payments. And then the last one is due January 15th of the next year. So they give you a little break there. But at the end of the day, if you have no tax, if the clergy has no taxes withheld, they're going to be responsible for these and these dates. And it is not your job as a payroll person in the house of worship to remind them. This is their personal tax stuff. By the way, they can pay on irs.gov on the website. Okay, so clergy can request an extra withholding. I love this. And this was the little box I had at the beginning. They can voluntarily withhold income tax to cover federal income tax and Social Security. all they have to do is fill out a W-4 and say, can you just withhold $400 a month or $400 out of every paycheck so that I know that that money is taken out on a regular basis and paid in on my behalf on a regular basis. And when they give you that form, you can say, sure, actual withholding, no problem. And it shows up in box 2 as federal income tax withheld. It's a great idea. Personally, I recommend it to my clergy because they don't have to think about those quarterly dates, okay? States have a similar form. The clergy can say, hey, as long as I'm doing that, can you also just take out some money for state because I'm going to owe that money at the end of the year, okay? All right, third thing, common misconception is that the clergy must file, and this is, okay, I'm going to read it first, that the clergy must file a Form 4361, otherwise Social Security and Medicare taxes will be withheld. That is 100% wrong. The Form 4361 has no bearing on withholding. Social Security and Medicare are never withheld from clergy's payroll check. The Form 4361 is about conscientious opposition to the acceptance of public insurance, has nothing to do with the withholding, and the Form 4361 cannot be filed for economic reasons and is irrevocable. This is really important because I actually had a client not too long ago that said, my church demanded that I fill out a Form 4361 so that they didn't have to pay Social Security and Medicare. And that is, again, we need to be really careful what we're doing as a house of worship. So really quickly, the Form 4361 is that one exception from SE taxes under very limited circumstance. Remember the one that I put a little star next to? This form is an irrevocable election between the clergy and the IRS, and they cannot fill this out for economic reasons. They can't go, well, you know, if I don't have Social Security and Medicare withheld, I'll get more money in my paycheck. That's an economic reason. They have to be able to agree to the reasons for the exemption. Really quickly, they have to certify that they are opposed to the acceptance of any public insurance, including Social Security and Medicare. They have to file the form by a timing deadline. They have to inform the church or licensing body of the church that they are filling out this application and that they are conscientiously opposed. They need to verify the grounds of their exemption under penalties of perjury, which is they're signing that. And then they have to wait. They're going to receive, if it's approved, they will receive an approved copy of the Form 4361 from the IRS, okay? So here's a key point. The clergy must inform the church that a Form 4361 has been filed. This is important because the church needs to know that they're saying, I'm going to make myself exempt from having from Social Security and Medicare. Well, they're already not going to have Social Security and Medicare withheld, but they're basically saying, I'm going to have a 0 on my SE tax form. And that can be an issue for the house of worship because they could come back and go, I can't believe how small my Social Security check is. Okay, this is the same person that said they were conscientiously opposed to actually getting Social Security, and now they're going to complain because their Social Security is so small, right? So we have a little disconnect there. Anyway, here are some useful resources. The publication 517, I have some resources in my Good Steward Church Academy. I have an entire library with over 200 hours of teaching on all kinds of subjects. And then here are some really quickly, and I know we're 2 minutes after, but really quickly, some deals that we have. I did a training course specifically designed for houses of worship through QuickBooks Made Easy, and I'm so grateful for that opportunity. And this is a training course, do-it-yourself training that takes you from soup to nuts on how to set up your forms and all that kind of stuff. And we do go in a little bit to the pastor. There's a discount code there. QuickBooks Made Easy has a tech support option. This is the highest value, lowest cost proposition to work with a CPA. I am just telling you, on the planet. And because you're a house of worship, those tech support calls will come to me as the church lady. So there's a discount code to get $200 off a year of tech support. Here's a QR code to join my Good Steward Church Academy with a code to get $50 off the annual fee for an entire year. So that's that. And then we do have that 3-day webinar coming up that Greg mentioned earlier, coming up July 29th, 30th, and 31st on how to use QuickBooks Online for houses of worship. So it kind of takes that do-it-yourself training to a whole new level, new information from when that was recorded, and we actually show you how to use QuickBooks on that. All right, so last poll question. Would you like to subscribe to our Quick Tips newsletter? And we'll go ahead and put that up. Absolutely, sign me up. No, but thanks for asking. Or no, I'm already a subscriber. So go ahead and fill that out. And while you're doing that, I just want to say thank you. First of all, I'm gonna let that ride for just a minute. Thank you to TechSoup for the opportunity to do this. I think this is so valuable to our churches, and to QuickBooks Made Easy that has made it possible for me to get this information out to the world. So I'm very grateful for that. Thank you for all the nice comments. That's music to my ears. I really appreciate that. I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Aretha, if you have any last minute things that you wanted to talk about.
No, I just want to say you will get the recording probably by tomorrow, along with the slides. And thank you so much, Barbara and QuickBooks Made Easy, for being here. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.